right, David, nice to talk to you again. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you, Marty. It's great to be here.
All right, cool. So this is a continuation on our conversation that was cut short last week, or it was Tuesday last week, right? So
Mhm.
why don't you give us a recap on what you'd like to talk about and maybe a quick overview of what we covered in the previous conversation?
Okay. Well, we did an introduction to smart lighting and talked about quite a lot of different things, in particular smart switches, smart dimmers, and smart bulbs, and some of the advantages and considerations with all of that. And there were a couple of things that we touched on that I thought we should expand on, and in particular, the idea of using sensors to automate lights and I mentioned that there were two kinds of technology there. So it would be quite good to expand on that. But perhaps the biggest thing we really need to talk about is the concept of scenes and zones, because lighting design and how you actually implement the physical lighting is important.
Okay, well, look, right before this call, I was actually studying a little bit because this is an area that I don't really understand. I don't really know anything about it. So before the call, I thought I better bone up a little bit. And anyway, we'll get to that later on. But I was just studying a little bit about that before our call. But where would you like to begin?
Okay, well, let's start with the sensors because I made the claim that with smart dimmers, there were more automation possibilities. And when you link them with appropriate sensors, you can start doing interesting and useful things, such as not just turning the lights on when you enter a room and turning them off, hopefully, when you leave the room. You can change the lighting levels depending on the time of day. So late night trips out on the landing or to the bathroom can become much more comfortable. You don't have the lights turning on full and searing your retinas. And to me, that's a useful thing.
And for me as well, I've got the bladder of a baby bird, and I'm doing multiple trips to the bathroom each night. So this is something that would be useful for me as well.
Yeah. So historically, the way of doing that is to use a passive infrared PIR motion sensor. And these detect IR bright objects, so warm bodies, really, moving across a sensor. And they're fairly good at detecting people moving in front of them. So getting the lights to come on when you enter a room is probably not too much of a problem, providing the sensor and the bulb are somehow linked together, either directly or indirectly through a smart hub. And we talked about that. The problem really comes in turning them off again afterwards. Now, the usual way of doing this is to set a time limit for the sensor that if it hasn't seen movement for whatever period you define, it says, okay, there's nobody here. And the system will turn the lights off. The problem with that, of course, is if you're in a bathroom, it's quite probable that you're going to be not moving around a great deal. And so you must have had the situation. It happens in commercial buildings as well. You're in the bathroom and you're standing still, and all of a sudden the lights go dark. And how do you recover from that? You can start waving your arms around in the hope that the sensor is going to pick up your movement, or you can just blindly struggle for the door. So that's not so great.
It's happened to me many,
So
many times. And usually what I do, I sort of just sit and just hope somebody comes in and turns the lights back on. Yeah.
yeah, that's another strategy that could work, but it's far from ideal, really. The interesting thing is that PIR sensors have been around for a very long time, and because they are low power and can be made very compact, battery-powered sensors using Zigbee or Thread or something of that sort can actually be very practical. You can glue them up anywhere, and the batteries hopefully will last for maybe years. So that's the plus side of it. But recently, there's been some developments with what are known as occupancy sensors as opposed to motion sensors. And these use a completely different technology. It's usually described as millimeter wave. It's a form of radar, if you will, using usually 60 gigahertz signals, so very, very high frequency. And these are sensitive to the most minute movements. So even just breathing is enough for them to sense and actually know where you are in the room as well, some of them. And so they transmit continuously and monitor the reflections that are coming back from everything in the room. The more advanced ones can actually track more than one person in more than one zone, but basic ones are therefore able to detect truly that there's still somebody in the room, and so they will not do the turn off until such time as it has genuinely become empty. It's the same problem if you're watching a movie in a home cinema setup. You don't want the system to turn off in the middle of the movie just because you've been sitting still. So occupancy sensors are an emerging technology. What I find interesting is it's the smaller players that are producing the products, the big names, and I'm thinking of Philips and Hue. They don't have any technology in that area at the moment. So right now, if you want to do something like this, you're going to have to get a third-party product and integrate it with whatever else you've got. So it's not quite as straightforward as buying a single system and hoping it will do everything for you. But Philips are approaching it in a completely different way. I don't know whether you know, but they actually have a two-brand approach. They have Wiz lighting. Have you come across that?
I think I've heard.
WIZ.
Yeah.
And Wiz uses Wi-Fi and is a Matter device. And Hue, as we already discussed, uses Zigbee. But what Wiz has done for quite some time is use the Wi-Fi in the room as a form of radar. So if you have two bulbs, one acts as a beacon and one acts as a sensor. And so the bulbs can actually sense occupancy with no additional hardware whatsoever. Now, I've never tried it, so I don't know how well it works, but it must do quite a good job.
Wow, I've never heard that. That's amazing.
No, well, you can look it up on the Wiz website. I think they call it Space Sense, but I may be wrong on that. But recently, what is even more interesting is that the CSI connectivity standards that police Zigbee and Thread and Matter have announced that there's a similar technique that's going to be applicable to Zigbee stroke Thread. And so it's quite possible that at some point we will see Philips Hue bulbs and other Zigbee or Thread bulbs having much the same kind of sensing ability.
So if this happens, and you haven't specifically mentioned Akara or any brand that does this.
Yeah, well, they do have some very good millimeter wave sensors right now and an expanding range.
Yeah, well, I haven't actually bought any yet. But like if this plays out, what you've just described, would that make it possible a scenario where you don't actually need a millimeter wave sensor? You can just, by virtue of having some Zigbee bulbs, and that's it.
Yeah, it could well be. Yeah. I can see some pros and cons. Obviously, there's the fact that there's no additional hardware is amazing. The technology uses 2.4 gigahertz, so it probably doesn't see through walls so readily. Whereas the millimeter wave stuff might have better coverage area. I don't know. Depends on the power. And that comes back to where the snag is. Because these things are transmitting all the time, they can't run on battery. They need mains power. So delivered via a USB connection or something like that. So suddenly you're going to use a wired sensor if you're using some of the earlier car ones. But there are some new generation ones coming along very quickly, which use a hybrid of a PIR sensor and millimeter wave sensor. And so the motion sensor is triggered and that wakes up the millimeter wave to start transmitting and locate you precisely. I'm not quite sure how it saves energy once it's been triggered, but it now has battery lives which are acceptable.
That's amazing. And yeah, I was kind of wondering about that exactly. I didn't know that the motion sensor wakes up the millimeter wave functionality. And to your point about, how does that go with a battery powered device? I imagine it's fine if you're only in the room for 5 minutes, an hour, or whatever the case may be. As long as it's not on 24/7, it's going to extend the life a lot, I would imagine.
Yeah. My hunch is that what actually happens is it wakes up and then it's turning on and off at regular intervals to save power because you don't really care if you leave the room, whether it takes a few extra milliseconds to turn off or not. So that's my guess. But but the development of these things is not stopping there. I've recently seen a Kickstarter campaign for one from an Australian company called Lincoln Link. I can't remember now. And they've integrated into a hybrid motion and millimeter wave sensor, light sensing and humidity sensing as well, all in a battery powered device. So a single box that can do all of that. That's quite interesting.
A side tangent here, but do you think maybe part of the reason why Philips have opted for some different approaches might be because there are patents around some of this technology, or what do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Short answer, I don't know, but it's a compelling reason to stick with an ecosystem that is known and works well and try and switch to something else, I guess. But I guess at the end of the day, it all depends on whether it works for you or not. I certainly am looking forward to deploying some of these newer sensors because yeah, I'm a bit fed up with being plunged into darkness when you're not moving around. But to go back to the automation idea, whatever sensor you're using, you can use conditional logic, as we would say, so that the sensor doesn't trigger the light to come on if it's already light enough in the room using an extra light sensor. Or you can schedule it so that during the middle of the night it comes on very dim for the convenience. So there's quite a lot of things that you can do. And of course, if you have color changing light, you can change the light to be more acceptable as well. Did you know that red light is more visible in a smoky environment? Which is why the escape lights on aircraft, you probably did know this.
Well, I didn't know that specifically, but I do know at night it's better for your night vision to not destroy your
Yeah,
night vision to use
yeah,
a shade of red.
yeah, yeah. So I use shades of red as well for the low level lighting. But yeah, I think that the automation possibilities are quite interesting and really useful. And using sensors, I mean, they're not the only sensors, of course. You can use contact sensors for things like doors opening and closing, but I don't find them to be as reliable a way of determining whether somebody's in a room or not. They're probably okay for a cupboard.
Yeah. You're exactly right. Exactly right. I previously had a contact sensor on our front door, and I was trying to think of a use case, like how can I do this reliably and make it work the way I want it to work? And I ended up just not being able to figure it out, and it got rid of it. So now what we're doing for lights outside our front door is we have a motion sensor, a Kara motion sensor, and then we've got some Zigbee smart bulbs out there, and it works a charm. But I did actually consider getting a millimeter wave presence sensor, and I decided against it. I thought, look, it's going to be hard for me to get my hands on here. It's overkill. It's more expensive. Let me start with this motion sensor, and that's fine for my purpose. But I would like to get my hands on one of these new Kara or some other brand. By the way, are there any other
Yeah.
brands doing this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think there are, but Akara is the number one brand that comes to mind, mainly because they introduce a good, expensive product to start with, and they're already producing newer versions which are cheaper and arguably more efficient, and certainly hybrid battery powered ones is a very interesting step forward. So yeah, I think that it's limited by your imagination, really.
Okay, so let's go to a practical example here. You talked about it's the middle of the night, you're woken up because you need to go for a trip to the bathroom, which happens to me just about every single night. How would you go about solving this problem? What do you think about
Yeah.
a motion sensor versus a millimeter wave sensor? Let's start there.
Okay. Well, I think that a motion sensor or two or even three might be necessary. Depends on the path that you need to take. And they work well until such time as you return to bed and you want the things to turn off. So it's a fine skill to define how long do I leave the lights on before going off? And I've spent quite a lot of time fine tuning that, and I think I've probably got it about right now. But uh, the bigger problem, once you start doing automation of this sort, is what about if there are other people in the room? And if you've automated it so that when you come in during the early evening, the lights come full on, and somebody's gone to bed early, you're going to wake them up when you come into the room. So that's really tricky. And I've seen other people tackle it by putting pressure mats under the mattress to detect if somebody's in bed or not. I haven't gone that far myself, but a possible workaround is to use PIR sensors, or better yet, occupancy sensors to tell that somebody's actually in the bed, because even if they're asleep and breathing, it will pick up their presence, and that will modify the logic. So yeah, I think you might actually end up using occupancy or presence sensors more than motion sensors to get a foolproof system that works for everybody in the house.
Yeah, it's something I'm very interested in. I think that's probably going to be one of the next projects that I attack here. It's definitely interesting to me. One thing I'm thinking about though is if I don't, like, let's say Akara, right? Let's say I go out and I get some Akara presence sensors and I've got some Akara lights, but I don't have an Akara hub. I'm using the Homey Pro ecosystem. I've got a Homey Pro hub.
Mm.
I feel like I'm limited in what functionality I can get out of the bulbs. And can I have one brightness during the day and a different brightness at night in Homey? Is that easy
Oh
to
yeah, for
do?
sure. Yeah, yeah. In Homey, there are cards, as they call them, which are logical commands that get evaluated when they're triggered. And you can certainly have a variety of time-related cards. It's not just the time of day, but even days of the week or days of the year. So I use something like that for my smart light. So during the week, they open earlier than they do at the weekend and things like that. So yeah, you can do that.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's a bit of a side point maybe we can come back to, but I just feel like because I don't have an Akara hub, but I do have some Akara lights, I just feel like I'm missing some of the control, some of the potential.
Yeah, I suspect that well, in fact, I know this to be the case. That a lot of the Akara functionality is only unlocked if you have an Akara hub. I've recently had exactly that experience. I've been evaluating one of the new Akara H2 smart switches, which is a very interesting product because it's both Zigbee or Thread in the one product, and it's software selected. Very interesting product, but it has two buttons, and it turns out that they're not on and off, which is what you might expect. One button is on or off, it toggles to the actual connected light, and the other button is a wireless button that can be used to do anything. But it turns out that Homey doesn't recognize that button, whereas the Akara Hub does. And I've read that Matter is meant to support it. So it may well be that in due course, other controllers get updated to use it. But at the moment, I can't use the bottom button.
Look, I could go on the side tangent here, but I won't because I know we're here to talk about some other things. So I'll let you move on to
Yeah,
the thing. But maybe that's something we can come back to some other time because it's yeah, it
yeah,
drives me
yeah.
nuts.
Okay. Okay. So we've talked a lot about the control of lighting and why you might want to do things and the advantages of the different control methods. But what we haven't really talked about is what might be called a lighting design, and really the number of lights that you have in a space and what functions they do. And very briefly, in any kind of environment, you're going to have different kinds of lighting. There's the ambient lighting, accent lighting, task lighting, and you may even have what's sometimes referred to as kinetic lighting. So things that have got special effects, color changing or movement, things like that. And in certain spaces, you might have all of those, or maybe just a couple of them. But the key to it, of course, is having multiple different luminaires or light fixtures. So we touched on the fact that you might have a ceiling light in a bedroom and a pair of bedside lamps. That's a good first starting place. But you might find that if you're in a modern apartment or a larger property, you've got an open plan living space, which is dining, sitting area, kitchen. It's multifunctional. And it's very unlikely that you want all the lights on in all of those areas any given time. You probably want to change the lighting for different activities. So if you're dining or cooking, that's going to be different from watching TV or reading a book. So the chances are that to create a cozy look, you're not just going to rely on a very large number of downlights in the ceiling. You're going to use table lights, floor standing lamps, reading lamps, all manner of other kind of lighting. So if you've gone to the trouble of doing all of that, you'll know that when you go to bed, it's an enormous pain to have to go around half a dozen table lamps, turning them on and off manually before you can go out the door. It would be so much more convenient if you could do it all from the door. So the naive approach is to have them all wired back to a lot of switches on the wall. And I see it still quite frequently. You go into a new build, into a kitchen that is an open plan space that does 2 or 3 of those activities. There'll be something akin to a 12 switch grid pattern panel on the wall, and you have to sit there and figure out which light switch does which zone. It's a nonsense. That is not luxury, it's not convenience. So there has to be a better way. So what we've just talked about are zones. So there's a dining zone, there's a kitchen zone, there's a TV zone, there's a sitting zone, or whatever. But what you do with all of those zones is make them easy to control by having all of them respond to a single button press, or a single voice command, if you will. But the idea is that by pressing one button, I get the room to change lighting to suit the activity that I'm trying to do. So I might have dining, cleaning, cooking, watching TV, or other activities. And you can change the color and the brightness, and you completely change the look of the room by lighting it in a different way. And those are scenes, and it's incredibly useful. I've got, I think it's 6 zones of lighting in my kitchen, but there's just 5 buttons to control it. And one of them is off, one of them is full on for cleaning, and the others are for different activities like dining, cooking, watching TV. And that's just so much easier. You don't have to think about it. You just have to press one button.
Yeah, okay. So what is the overlap and what is the difference between scenes and zones, or do they work together?
They work together. Scenes probably could be used with even one zone. So even if you only had a ceiling light, it would be quite nice to have different preset brightnesses that you could select directly with a button, rather than fiddling with a knob or just standing there and pressing the button and waiting for the light to ramp up or down to it's just right for what you want to do. So even with one zone of lighting, scenes have some value, but they really come into their own as soon as you get multiple zones. And even 2 is worth doing. So for example, in the bedroom that we talked about earlier with a ceiling light and bedside lights, that's actually, with smart bulbs, 3 zones. Technically, it's the left and the right side of the bed and the ceiling. And so I think you can see straight away that you've got different activities, like one of you wants to read, the other one doesn't, and you don't want the ceiling light on when you want the bedside lights on low. And what do you do with your trip to the bathroom scene? You only light your side of it. And so it's the flexibility. And too often people don't understand the power and convenience of scenes. They understand zones because that's what they've been used to. It's lots of switches on the wall, each one controlling a separate zone. But it becomes tortuous to use when the number of zones gets larger than just 2, really. I see it a lot in the forums that people are coming to this. They start asking for, I want a 4-gang or a 6-gang smart switch. No, you don't. That's probably the worst thing you could probably have. What you actually want is a keypad that has a number of scenes on it, and then intelligently map that to whatever your smart lighting is. So it might be smart bulbs if they're color changing. It might be smart dimmers or smart modules somewhere in the ceiling or in the wall. Who knows? But it's the usability of having a keypad that makes it so much easier.
Sounds interesting. Right before this call, I actually ended up watching one of Brian from Automate Your Life. He published a video about 9 months ago about Homey Moods, which are scenes, right? It was very, very interesting. In fact, I might even share that link if someone wants to check it out, because I think I need to go back and
Yeah.
watch it myself.
Homey Moods are scenes plus, if you will, because it's not just lighting scenes, it's other devices at home you control. So you can have a single button that sets the lights and plays some music or whatever is appropriate to what you want to do. So
Well, other ecosystems can't do anything. Scenes are only lighting for other
no,
ecosystems.
the term mood is unique to Homey. I think SmartThings still refers to them as manually triggered routines. They used to call them scenes, and they've changed the names, and I don't really understand that. But different platforms have different ideas about it. But generally, a powerful smart hub will control more than just the lighting. It can control the air conditioning for a home cinema. You know, you turn the lights to dim with the exit lights lit up or whatever, but you want the air conditioning to be comfortable while you're watching a movie, as well as it being dark. And it would also, of course, control natural lighting by closing blinds and closing curtains and lowering an electric projection screen, all with the press of one button.
Now, someone like me, David, I'm hearing what you're talking about, and my mind is immediately jumping to, I can have 1,000 different automations for every 5-minute segment of the day, based on this, based on that. If it's 10:35 and 10:40 at night, I want to have this. It's going to be slightly different if it's after 10:45. How much of this do you think I should be thinking about trying to automate versus just have it, control and a button?
That's a very good question. I don't think there's a simple answer to it, but I noticed that several of the other YouTube streamers have recently begun to realize that they've over-automated stuff, and actually it's better to keep it completely simple. My thinking is this: the automation should be helpful and not hindrance. And if it becomes frustrating, then it's the wrong thing. And it's great for people like you and me who are creating it. We understand what's going to happen and the limitations of it, but somebody else just sees it as an irritation. And why the hell have we got this stuff? It's not making my life any more.
What is it doing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm sure you will have, if you haven't already. I have the comment. I'm denied the simple pleasure of closing the blinds when it gets dark. Yeah. Or they're closing and it's still light outside.
Not ready
yet. So yeah, it's tricky. My philosophy there is never automate something that doesn't have a manual control to override it.
This is a really important lesson for me to hear at this point of my smart home journey. And maybe if any other newbies, complete new people to thinking about smart homes are watching this, I think this is an important lesson as well. But personally speaking, I think I'm definitely at risk of over automating things and just trying to create 1,000 different automations. And like you said, maybe just keep it simple. Think about the times where it's 100%, that's exactly what you're going to want, definitely. And maybe automate that, and other things, maybe it's fine just to have manual control, whether it's voice or switch.
Yeah. And one of the things that none of the platforms are particularly good at is being able to tell it that you don't want the automation to run, that you want to temporarily suspend it. So, for example, if you're away from home, you might want different behavior. So you probably don't want the music system to play waking up music in the morning because you're not there. Being able to quickly and easily disable things is quite tricky. Certainly, Amazon don't offer an easy way of doing that. So yeah, it comes back to something we talked about before, which is simulated occupancy. You want to be able to press one button or one voice command and cancel all the automations that are doing things that you don't want to happen, like turning on the electric blanket and things like that. You won't have that problem, of course.
Well, I guess as a Homey user, one practical way you could solve that problem, which is not ideal, but one way you could solve the problem is just to go into the flows and just disable it while you happen to be away
Oh
from.
yeah, yeah, you can do it from an app. It's the other people in the house that are not going to be able to do that, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. By the way, David,
Yeah.
we've just had the pop up from Zoom that we've got 9 minutes remaining here.
Oh, okay. Well, there's one more thing that I really wanted to touch on, and that's replacing smart switches that are part of a so-called two-way circuit. We touched on this last time with rooms like halls and stairs and landings, where oftentimes you have switches at different ends of the space, and both of them can turn it on or off. When you start talking about doing things with smart switches or smart dimmers, it gets a weeny bit more complicated. And although I could spend a long time talking about the technological differences about all of the methods that are used, it's probably sufficient to know that you are almost certainly going to replace one switch that actually controls the lighting, and all the other switches you're going to replace with some kind of remote control of that switch. So they no longer switch the load directly. How those talk to one another is the technicalities of it. But the solution is probably to stick with a single brand and look for the primary and secondary controls, or whatever they call them, and follow how the manufacturers decided that they're going to do it. Trouble is, they all do it differently, and but it's a mistake to think I need a two-way smart switch. It doesn't exist. They're all multi-location capable, but two-way is a form of wiring, and it really doesn't apply to smart dimmers in particular. There are some smart modules that can retrofit with existing wiring, but I don't want to go into that at the moment. But it's a bit of a minefield. It's probably another reason that if you're not prepared to make some changes and maybe using an electrician, you could stick with smart bulbs and wireless buttons over the top of the dumb switches.
Well, like you said in our
So
prior conversation, if you're a renter, maybe going with smart bulbs is just the best way anyway.
I think so. And I've often thought about this. And Philips, of course, is a European manufacturer. Its biggest market is Europe, and the majority of home residents are renters in Europe. So it plays to their strengths. So I think that's why we haven't seen smart switches from the likes of Philips or smart dimmers. It's all about bulbs and wireless controls because it suits their market better.
Interesting. And not to hijack your point, but in our prior conversation, you also talked about a module that you could retrofit behind the switch, which could
Yeah.
would make like a single dumb switch, like a two gang. Is this kind of related to the multi-point switching, or is this not related to the
Yes,
point?
it is. Yeah, yeah. You can certainly implement multi-location switching using those modules and do it in software. I was talking about the Philips Hue module for that purpose. Other modules are available on different platforms. So once you've got multiple endpoints, user interfaces, whatever they are, you can implement any kind of logic in the smart hub. But one of the things that is interesting is that if you do it with just a single zone, for example, you've got a single gang switch that turns the ceiling light on and off, and you put one of those modules behind it, suddenly the switch behaves like the switches behave on your stairs or your hall. In other words, it doesn't have a defined on or an off state because it depends what state the bulb's in. All you know is if you flick it, it's going to go to the opposite state, which is a change in how it works.
Oh,
So yeah, um, it's obvious when you think about it, but it just means that hey, that switch is in the on position, but the light is off. How does that work?
mm,
Because you haven't thought about it.
yeah.
But it's two-way between the software and the physical switch.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, as a renter myself, and we're going to be moving from this home to a different place sometime fairly soon. So I'm very reluctant to go and mess around with any wall solution. Definitely not going to mess around with calling an electrician to change any wiring. So I think for the short term, we're just going to be using smart bulbs. But maybe in our next home, depending on how long we're planning on staying there, maybe I can look at some of these wall solutions that you've described.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of wireless solutions out there, and you can mix and match if they use the same technology. I'm using a whole plethora of Zigbee devices and Z-Wave as well, and the hub just merges them all into one cohesive system. But yeah, there are definitely ways of doing it without being distracted. But interestingly enough, what there is a shortage of in the market is little devices that you can sit by the bed on your bedside table or whatever it is, a remote control, if you will. I use some of the Philips Hue wireless dimmers, which are little devices, and you can just sit them by the bed as a remote control. But if you want to control other devices, such as blinds, electric blanket, pop-up TV, whatever it is that you've got, Philips is too focused on lighting to be able to make those extra connections, so you need something else. And there's a dearth of little remote control type consoles or handheld remotes that can do lots of different things. And of course, the problem we get with a keypad or of any sort, as soon as it's got more than a few buttons on it, how do you know which button does what?
It's very
You've got the labeling problem. Yeah, and I have, I don't know whether you've seen this. This is the Philips Hue tap switch, and their solution is to label the buttons. You probably can't see it. It's got 1 to 4 dots on it.
Pretty hard to see.
And it's got a rotating dial for dimming control as well. And how the hell would I know which one of those buttons turns the lights on in the room?
Yeah, especially if it's dark.
Yeah. And even more weirdly, if I press a button and it gets the light on, how do I then turn it off? And it turns out that pressing it again doesn't turn it off. You have to press and hold and wait for it to turn off.
Okay.
Which is so counterintuitive. I'm not sold on that as a viable interface for guests and visitors. They'll never figure that out. They'll turn everything on and then.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, if you're the person that sets it all up, you can probably you understand it. But for anybody else, like, good luck.
Yeah. So interestingly, some of the pro level systems have ways of labeling the buttons. I mean, the most simple way, of course, is to have the panel engraved. That's the usual way of doing it. But then if you change your mind, re-engraving a panel is an expensive proposition. Others use LCDs and actually label the buttons with text. Or of course, the ultimate is to use a touch screen in the wall, and then you can have anything you like. But as soon as you go to a touch screen, you can't find them in the dark. So, until it wakes up, and then there's a whole nother game there. But it's an interesting one. In the meantime, I use a label maker and just stick labels on them. So,
seems like it works. David, we've got a minute until this call is going to get cut off. So I want to thank you for coming back to round off this conversation. Personally, inspired me to go out there. I think I'm going to have to get an Aqara, one of these new battery-powered millimeter wave sensors for the bathroom visits. I think that's something I'm going to put on the short-term to-do list. But final word from you, anything you want to mention?
No, other than we've talked about the fact that blinds and window treatments in general are an integral part of lighting control, and certainly with scenes that control natural and artificial light, I think we can see that that's a good fit, and that's something we might talk about again at a later date.
I'd love to, because when we move to our next home, that's something that's definitely going to be on our to-do list as well. So great to talk to you again now, David, and hopefully we can chat again sometime soon.
That's great. Thanks once again, Marty. I'll speak to you soon.